Okay, so how do I look?
You look lovely.
Okay.
My current name is D.D. Brown, but I'm also known as Orange Blossom. I'm a male to female transsexual. I transitioned in 2011. I'm a nurse. I work in the NHS and I've done that for 35 years and I get to retire in October.
My name's Serena Hickson. I'm program manager at Spectra London, and we're a organisation that provides peer support for trans people in London, including social groups, peer mentoring and counselling. All our services are free, and it's my job to make sure that all three aspects of the service are cohesive and we actually are providing optimised support for trans people.
My name is Mjolnir. My pronouns are they, them and she, her. I work in a cafe as a waitress and I hope to work with animals one day.
I'm Brunhilde, my pronouns are she, her. I'm a student at the University of Hertfordshire and I don't know what my pension is just yet.
I'm Alessandra, I'm 26, I'm a trans woman. I've been living in London for 7 or 8 years. I'm currently a software engineer. Typical sort of. I also do tutoring for kids for physics and maths. I've more recently taken up a lot more kind of political activism and generally a lot more activism. So that's it for me. I mean, I do rollerblading. Yeah, I do any sport where I get to do cool tricks.
Well, I grew up in a very conservative area, so I suppressed that stuff very, very quickly. To just as like a survival tactic, really, because I don't think I would have had nearly as easy a childhood as I did if I knew I was non-binary or trans. I only came out when I was 17 to myself and to my parents.
I grew up in Greece. My mum is Italian, my dad is Greek. Obviously, up until the age of 18, I don't even think I knew what a trans person was, essentially. Once I got to London and I started going to university here, I kind of met with a lot more LGBT people, and I kind of got to, I actually had a friend, fairly close friend that came out years before me, etc. It was amazing for me because she put it in perspective that I'm like, oh, this isn't just a thing about people, it's about people I know. So I had that in my mind, and I definitely had plenty of years of, I feel like it would just be a case study in denial, essentially. I basically gave myself every reason to invalidate myself for years, because the kind of thought process works is oh, if that were the case, I will be trans, and that would be very bad, so I'm not, even if every single piece of evidence points to that.
I mean, I think I'm fairly atypical in that I never had any gross gender dysphoria, as I kind of led a dual life whereby I was male at work and female virtually the second I finished. I started to get more, I suppose, dysphoria about the changing to go to work. It's kind of like, well, I don't have to change to go to work. I can transition and then I won't have to. There was 2 leaving parties at work and I went to one of them in my male mode and I was sat there, sat next to this gay guy who's kind of said, oh, you seem a bit down. And I just kind of said, yeah, I feel a bit of a fraud. And I kind of explained that I was trans and actually I've kind of come in drab to go out, and they said, well, what about next week? And he's just like, oh, I don't know. He said, well, just come as you, don't come as the fraud. So I just did.
My mum, she was actually asking me if I thought I might be trans, years in advance. I didn't have a very good time at school, even not being trans, but I ended up coming to terms with the fact I was trans about 16 and immediately came back to everyone. And since then I've been messing with the NHS and they haven't given me anything yet. It's been 3 years.
I felt very passive towards life in general, and I felt like I just let a lot of events just kind of pass me by, and I was just passively experiencing them. And the moment I decided, no, I can actually do this, I can actually transition, I realized how much power I actually held over me and that I could actually be an active agent in my own life. As far as family goes, I think I actually got incredibly lucky. Both my parents are absolutely lovely, they're incredibly supportive, and I was still terrified to come out to them. I am constantly filled with a weird kind of survivor's guilt because I know that my situation is the exception, and the thing that upsets me is that I know that it should be the baseline.
I started transitioning 5 years ago, made the determination. I think I watched a YouTube video, the person who was showing off a transition timeline. I think it actually just ignited something for me, and I realized, oh gosh, this person, I was in floods of tears because I thought this person is really telling my story. And the next day I actually just went out and got myself a pair of shoes and researched online, found, and I don't advise anybody to self-medicate, but I was so determined to actually just press forward with my transition that I actually self-medicated for about 2 years, and pretty badly, I might add. You know, I was constantly exhausted, and I was taking something, shall remain nameless, which is a chemical castrative tablet. And so I had no sex drive for at least 3 years. I went through the whole rigmarole, working full time and also suffering with the effects of too much estrogen in my system, fighting with the testosterone. And so I really struggled for a long time. But, you know, hey, I got there eventually.
As a lot of, I think, of amab people started doing, essentially, like, it is kind of a weird and very, very big step at the beginning, because I think once you start presenting even slightly more femme in a way, that's when you start being read as queer, essentially, of some sort. That wasn't really a problem for me, but it was like essentially through that is what I realized, that when people were reading me kind of essentially as a queer guy, I was like, wait, I'm not okay with this. And that was kind of one of the last light bulb moments. I'm like, okay, there's clearly something very specific that is going wrong here.
I mean, in some respects, I suppose I kind of conform a little bit to the expectations to make life easier for myself. It's kind of like, for 40 odd years, I wore trousers, so to wear trousers kind of gives me kind of feelings of maleness. But then I know that I kind of look round and I see that I'm the only person in the skirt. It does change over time. As you kind of feel more comfortable in your own skin, I feel more comfortable. I think first of all, when I first transitioned, it was, I must not wear a pair of trousers. And now I feel like it's okay. When
it comes to passing and stuff, like, I've not really tried to concern myself with that, and that makes me feel quite self-conscious even so, like, even as I try to distance, because I think the idea of passing as a trans woman is something that's rooted in the patriarchy, where we expect feminine people, or women especially, to have to perform the gender role that we expect cis women to have. And not only that, but like, my dysphoria never came from like the way I presented, it was just more like how people perceived me. I would like to, because you look at me now, I've got like these big brown work boots, and I've got boot-cut jeans and fingerless gloves, and I wear big woolly jumpers, and I dress like a farmer. And I would just like to wear that and not have people think I'm a man.
All I knew is that I wanted to express myself in a feminine-esque, if that's ever been an English word, way.
It is now.
You know, I just wanted to be really comfortable in expressing myself in my gender, and that for me was pretty solidifying. You know, it wasn't just a matter of wearing frilly knickers and stuff, which I've never been into. For me, it was never about dressing a certain way, because I think, interestingly dress quite boyish. You know, I wear my jeans and t-shirts, and I wear polo necks and stuff. I'm not quick on the draw to wear little, house of numbers. It's really just about expressing myself, being myself, because, the whole idea for me of being trans is that you just allowing yourself to, not so much, I think some people talk about being something, but for me it's really about allowing the expression as opposed to being something, or, that's why I think there was a film, The Danish Girl, I think it was, that really irritated me. The woman in the movie was copying women's, the way a woman walks and talks. And I thought, come on, I thought the whole idea about being trans and expressing yourself in a trans feminine way is to just allow yourself to be who you are. Some people perhaps need help if that's what you want to do. But I don't think that there's any formula that makes us trans enough.
we get caught in the endless dilemma, essentially, and these are obviously voices that are speaking in bad faith, that if we take on a lot of sort of characteristics of femme presentation or femme mannerisms, we are sort of accused of playing into gender stereotypes and accused of sort of playing into patriarchal like standards of like women's behaviour and femininity. And if we don't do that, and if we instead, for example, have more masculine mannerisms or masculine ways of clothing and presenting, we're just regarded as essentially less valid, as not real, as not taking this as seriously as we should. In my own experience, essentially, I think a lot of what has been like kind of a sore point for me is just more difficult to be read how you want to be read when presenting more masculine, which is really sad because I basically always have to make a choice between dressing how I want to and being read how I want to.
I struggle with this a lot because I have no interest in presenting feminine. Or maybe, I maybe want to present in a very specific kind of feminine way that is very hard to balance with being like visibly amab, because I want to be a buff butch woman, and Mona sometimes tells me that like I should stop holding myself to these standards, but like I don't really want to stop. I just want to like get to them, and I think that just medically transitioning and continuing to present how I present, I think I'd look pretty much exactly how I want.
Well, I did some vocal training. I have a really silly voice. By the end of the day, if I have to shout "help" at work, it's a bit like Penelope Pitstop. So I decided that it wasn't necessary. So, I mean, for me, that was kind of the one main thing that has an impact for me. So if I'm talking on the phone, I get served an awful lot, and it's quite sometimes a struggle to get through the ID check to get to details about my own bank account.
Trying to subscribe to a prescribed hyper-feminized way is, I think, a tremendous pressure for a lot of trans people, unless you transitioned very young. Oftentimes, dare I say it, testosterone poisoning often has taken effect and people's hips are very narrow and, certain body parts are well defined and body hairs well developed, and the voices are very strong and masculine sounding and the like. So I think not everybody achieves the same level of success when on hormones, and having expectations about what it means to be a set idea about what it means to be trans feminine, I think is foolhardy, and it's often a road to ruin. Seeing these often cartoonish characters that you see online with over edited pictures and crimped in waists and exaggerated breasts, I think that gives a totally unrealistic expectation about what the hormones can do. So unless you actually have you've got a lot of money at your disposal, very few of us can afford to be able to have facial feminization surgery. So I think it's very dangerous to espouse a certain way of presenting as being the optimum or as being the litmus test to define whether you're trans enough. Because I think we're all trans by self-definition.
Being a non-binary but like woman-aligned person who will never comfortably pass. I mean, I'm 6'3", I've got a relatively deep voice with some sort of feminine like tone, I guess. A feminine
place.
Yeah.
Throat.
I've got a big Adam's apple, and I use the women's bathroom because like that's my right, and like I feel very like big, I feel like a big like sort of creature that sort of like invaded something.
Like Sasquatch.
Yeah, like a Bigfoot, like just all waltzing in there, and I feel like eyes on me sometimes. Like I just want to go to the toilet and get out as fast as possible. I don't check my hair, I don't check my clothes or anything, because I've had a couple of experiences in the bathroom, just where like someone's like asked me a question and I have to answer it. You know, like, oh, where do you get your jumper? And I have to answer that to be polite, but then I know they're clocking me based on my voice and they're thinking something in their head that I don't know. And on the one hand, it's nice to be addressed, you know, not to be treated as an outsider, to be complimented and stuff sometimes, but on the other hand, it feels like a litmus test against me.
There's an element, I think, of distrust and fear about what it means to embrace trans people in all of our incarnations and all of our expressions. I think when people think of trans people, they're not quite sure what they're actually thinking about.
It was 2 years ago I saw an advert, because music's kind of the thing that's my main interest. I saw that Diva magazine was running a music festival, and it's kind of like, oh, that's really my cup of tea. I'd really like to go to that. But I had these kind of feelings about, oh, okay, so is a trans woman going to be accepted at a predominantly lesbian music festival?
It's always like that risk of like, what if it's TERFs?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But that isn't what I've experienced so far. I seem to have been kind of warmly accepted. Last year they rebranded it as Hear Her, and I think it's actually a really wonderful, it's a Ron seal of a name, it says exactly what it does on the tin. So it was set up by Heather Peace, and she's a female musician, plays keyboards and vocalist, and she set up this festival because the majority of festivals have 20% representation of females.
Oh my god.
And 80% male.
Yeah.
So they have 100% representation of female at a music festival.
So obviously, just like being LGBT on the internet, you end up finding yourself defending feminism from an awful lot of people. I feel like that puts one in a very pro-feminist mindset from the start. I think that it's hard to have an opinion about feminism because like there are so many people under like the banner of feminism, and you know, it was originated by the suffragette movement who were like racist, openly racist. And yet, if you look at people like whoever the woman was who wrote the book The Colour Purple, she coined the term womanism, which was like feminism except not racist, because she wanted a different label for people who weren't racist. But that didn't really catch on.
Most of my experiences with this and interacting both online and offline on spaces is about UK feminism, so I want to make this very clear that like the things I'm saying are specific about this sad rainy island. I have a difficulty decoupling a lot of essentially the transphobia of like British TERFs and British like transphobes, etc. from the British feminist movement. I know for a fact that like both my self-esteem and general transition was essentially slowed down by the rhetoric. I had internalized a lot of it, and it's frankly horrible. It's terrible. I know that it does real damage. It has done real damage to me. And no matter how much a feminist organization can sort of claim to be inclusive or claim to be essentially inclusive, I always find it really hard essentially to trust them. I don't feel like I belong there. I don't feel like my input is either wanted or appreciated, essentially. And it's very difficult to convince me otherwise.
Do you have an idea of what would be necessary to convince you otherwise? Like if a women's group is watching this, or someone who organizes one, what would they have to kind of do to be more welcoming?
I'm kind of, you know what, I'm actually kind of be towards this. Like obviously it would, you know, very much help if they had visible, you know, trans people, etc., actually leading the charge in that and saying, hey, we're actually ranking members of the organization and we're doing these things. I can always trust that if they've essentially elevated the voice of a trans person already. The second one would be to, and I want to be very clear about this, it would be to, with no sort of hand-wringing, no pearl-clutching, completely condemn groups such as Women's Place UK and LGBT Alliance, which are nothing but transphobic hate groups. I don't want to hear even a single peep essentially of going, oh, but maybe they have some good points, we just need to stop hurling things at each other. Unless you condemn these groups as what they are, I cannot possibly take you seriously in a commitment to include trans people. The second one, being a leftist myself, I do have a bit of a disappointment with a lot of liberal feminism because I think it completely fails to take into account, for a lot of it anyway, to take into account the realities of imperialism, the realities of colonialism, the realities of racism, and the realities of class. There's plenty of good ministries for this, but the point is like they need to be explicitly intersectional and they need to explicitly essentially mention that they care about these issues.
The big one that comes to mind is saying that trans women can't or will never be real lesbians because we're not born with vaginas. As a sort of like, as almost like sex-based phrenology. There's this whole thing where TERFs say like, trans women just want to date cis women and want to trap them and do horrible things to them, and that's stupid, because in my experience, trans people almost exclusively date other trans people, where our partner understands what it's like, you know, and it's also a lot safer generally. You know, because you're not like at risk of being abused for being trans. Like it, as sapphic trans people, like it just, you know, makes more sense to date another trans person in my head than to risk it with a cis person.
It's funny Milner mentions that, because I've been in 4 relationships, and the latter 3 of them were all with trans women. And like, I don't think I could ever form such a strong bond that I have with Milner with anyone else. But at the same time, I mean, I don't even know what my sexuality really is, and I kind of worry that like I'm not even that physically attracted to like trans women, even though I am one. Me and Milner have met up for the first time yesterday, and we've been all over each other, but like we've barely like kissed or touched each other like in any way that we considered sexual, because like I have no clue like where to start, and I don't even know if it's really for me, and I'm kind of worried about that, because like I love her so much.
Well, as I've said already, compound the imposter syndrome of being, say, in women's spaces, etc., and add to that the imposter syndrome of being like in queer space, in queer women's spaces. Because again, I have to stress, a lot of my essentially bad thoughts, etc., come from internalizing transphobic rhetoric that essentially view especially queer trans women as essentially predatory. It's like predatory men in women's spaces, which is terrible. And again, this is terrible rhetoric. It's absolutely baseless, but you know, it's the kind of thing that you constantly have in your mind, and it just makes you much more mindful about the way you both conduct yourselves than you even should be. I only recently went to a queer women's bar in London with my girlfriend, and I had a fairly warm reception. I was very happy about that. So,
If you don't mind me asking, is your girlfriend cis?
Yes.
Okay.
I assume so, but you know, I'm so essentially like, yeah.
In terms of, she's AFAB and currently identifies as a woman.
Yeah, exactly. I should just mention probably a small aside that she has mentioned sort of things
Gender queerness.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. It both surprised me, and I'm very glad, because she is nothing but supportive, obviously, and nothing but good. And these are all things that should be a given. But if I ever had even an inkling of doubt that she wasn't, I wouldn't be dating her. And yet she's given me nothing but, you know, the best, essentially, since the start, and I'm incredibly grateful. She's great. I'm just here to talk.
If you want to
about
just
how
gush
much I love
about
my
your
girlfriend.
girlfriend for 5 minutes,
No,
we can arrange for
I
that.
mean, no, she's fantastic. Again, it's like just here talking about how much I love my girlfriend. And she's just an amazing person in general, but I think specifically the things I was most worried about. I have about 1 million hang-ups about intimacy, 1 million hang-ups about being trans, and it's basically the first relationship I've had since coming out, a sort of long-term thing, and it's been just good. It's so surprising that that could even be a thing, because I didn't think I would be able to be in the situation of being a queer, like, it's like an open relationship, like a few years ago.
I think that the overriding imagery that we see of what it, exemplifications of, is that another word? Of what it means to be trans, or what, expressions of transness are very often not not black. There aren't very many examples of people of colour in the media. I think Monroe, I forget her name, Monroe something, Berghoff, I think it is. She's somebody that I, off the top of my head, think, oh God, she's a woman of colour, and she's representing, but few and far between. And I think that is endemic within wider society, not just London, but the UK, Europe, the whole 9 yards. I think black trans women, or women of colour who have trans experience, often part of the periphery, and we constantly need to fight for the right to just have a voice and to exist, because I think most platforms seem to encourage diversity, but I think that certainly the diversity isn't reflected in when I attend conferences and even localized meetings. You know, the very few trans women of color. In fact, I have to say, since working at Spectra, I've not met another trans person or woman of color specifically at any conference or meeting. I think one person who springs to mind who's a real inspiration, woman of color who's really making waves and creating a lot of opportunities for people to engage, is Miss Kimberly. And I think that what she's doing is really just opening the gates to enable people to actually listen to a different point of view and to actually garner different points of view from trans women. In of itself, she's actually a representation, a really powerful representation of what it means to be fearless in expressing who you are. And she's UK based, very proud of that, and she's somebody that I really admire. I think it's great what she's actually doing.
This is going to sound weird, but my biggest sort of inspiration for like who I want to be like was Marceline the Vampire Queen from Adventure Time. I'm now 6'3", but I used to be about 5'6" when I was 16. And as I got older and became more aware of how trans I was getting taller, and that scared me a little bit until I googled Marceline's height and found out she's about 6 feet tall. And I've always just been really attached to the character since, so not really transition goals, but more just sort of like, almost like a comfort icon, I guess.
I was always a big fan of feminine boys in anime, but since then it's all been buff women and strong women. At some point, I played Mass Effect for the first time. That was the first time when I really felt prepared to just like make my idealized self. I think ideal role model is just the Mass Effect version of myself.
Another character I've actually always had a kinship with, speaking of feminine boys, is Beast Boy from Teen Titans. He was like small and skinny, and like he didn't like his own appearance, you know, and I kind of felt a bit like that, where I was like, you know, small, awkward, didn't really fit in, like, didn't like how I looked and not really knowing why. And I've always been really attracted to his powers, which is that of shapeshifting, because like the idea that I could just change my body at will was just something I was just, for no reason whatsoever, really interested in. I made an OC when I was 15 who could transform into animals just like Beast Boy, and that helped me cope with that a little bit.
Super recently, because again I've been more involved in politics, etc. I am 26. It's really upsetting to see people like Zara Sultana, who is amazing, being like MPs, etc. at my age and advocating for things which I absolutely support, just because it's so difficult to actually get to that level, and them being managing spirit at the same age as me is amazing, but also enraging.
The things that kind of influenced me and my transition, or the way that I developed, was the transformation shop that was in Eversholt Street in Euston Road. So that was kind of an Aladdin's cave. It started off as transformations. There was 2 shops, one in Euston and one in Manchester. And if you didn't feel confident enough to go into shops to buy clothes, to buy shoes, to buy hosiery, you could order online. And they used to publish, and there used to be a shop that you could go to. And it was kind of like, no, something really, really amazing. There was nothing. You couldn't find out. You couldn't go on the internet to look up to find a group or anything. Yeah. And they used to publish a magazine. And in the back of the magazine, that's where you'd find out about Manchester Concord, or you'd find out about the Way Out Club. I mean, the Way Out Club was the very first club that I went to dressed. So, I mean, it's links to music in that my cousin was playing in the Anchor in Islington. The bass player, he's the drummer, and the bass player wanted to borrow my amplifier. And I went and I helped them out. But I worked out, it finished at like 11:30. And there was this club that you could go to called the Way Out Club. And so kind of going to a nightclub as an older person, I suppose it's kind of kept me young. seems to be this thing whereby lots of the older girls, because that's a comfortable place, which is predominantly a younger crowd, and I find that now I like lots of dance music. I mean, lots of people kind of explain it as kind of a puberty. It's like a second puberty.
Yeah. So kind of like the idea that it's not just a physical second puberty, but also...
No, it's a social second puberty as well.
I think the big thing about growing up in the UK in regards to LGBT history is that you never fucking get taught anything. You just, like, I grew up not even knowing what a trans woman was. You know, like the only times you see a trans woman is when they're either a villain in a horror movie or something to be laughed and mocked for being gross and weird, you know. Like, even as recently as like, I think it was 2018, 2017 with Outlast 2, which is a horror video game. One of the enemies is a trans woman called Val, who the first thing she does is rape the main character. And it's just, and that's what you get as your background radiation, is just immediately being characterized as this monster or this freak, and you never learn about the human beings throughout history who were trans. I think there was a Roman empress who was a trans woman who, you know, sought out gender confirmation surgery in like the 1st century, and everything, and like I never heard about that, and I think she's possibly the most misgendered historical figure in history, because everyone likes to say whenever there's a trans person, you always have to say they disguise themselves as the other gender. Like,
a cross-dresser, you
exactly,
say.
they were just a cross-dresser. They were just a drag queen or a drag queen. They did it to get a doctorhood, or they did it to be the king or whatever. And it's like, no, they were trans. Like, everyone always says, don't force our modern ideas of gender and sexuality on the past. And it's like, on the one hand, yeah, but on the other hand, like, some things are patently obvious that people are just unwilling to say out loud because it upsets the comfortable notion that something like being trans or LGBT or non-binary is entirely a 20th century invention, you know, like, and people would rather believe that we've just only sprang up as a community since, like, after Stonewall, and not been around as long as humans have been presenting with gender and expressing themselves through clothing and jewelry and things.
It invalidates a lot of like racial minorities as well.
Yeah.
Like cultures that have been colonized and largely erased by like the British Empire have had gender fluidity that now gets sort of torn away from them if they're going to integrate into like Western society, which everyone wants them to do. Like Native Americans, they have the Two-Spirit people.
In India, they have 3 legally recognized sexes.
We're creating history right now. So I think that when we talk about history, we often think about yesteryear, you know, but we're creating it now. And 20 years from now, people are going to look back and say, hey, you know, these, you know, people like Monroe, like Miss Kimberly, and all the allies as well, trans allies, have been really instrumental in pushing the agenda of enabling or allowing people to express who they are as along the spectrum of what it means to be trans, the spectrum of expressedness. And I think that as things change over time, you know, employment, romance and love and relationships and all of that good stuff that other people enjoy, hopefully they'll all just be, you know, fish and chip paper in 20 years. Oh yeah, we've been there, done that. Trans people are very much a part of society. It's no big deal. That, I think, is something that I really look forward to.
For an older generation, there was this feeling that it was something to be ashamed of. and something that you had to hide away. I mean, I had those fears that, you know, you had to cover up and make sure nobody knew, because otherwise you'd get found out, and then everyone would laugh at you and point the finger at you, and then you'd lose your job and your family, and then you'd lose your housing and things, all of which I have experienced.
Oh no.
But there you go. But I feel like I've had an easy time. So for people that have a difficult time, I really have no concept of how difficult things can be for people.
Growing up where I grew up, I never felt safe. The place where I grew up was already not great. Like, it's a very economically poor area. There's a lot of homeless people. I was actually living on the same street as two people who were wanted for assault and robbery, and that's the kind of environment that I had to grow up in. You know, it was like coming to London where everything's so big and loud and busy, and like there's these grand buildings with mountains of books behind us right now. Like, it's like being in an alien world compared to it, and I've never had a diverse and like strange community to be in. It's always just being like, if you differentiate yourself, you get eaten alive. It was difficult to have to like unlearn all these survival methods, and that was before I even knew I was trans. And now like trans hate crimes are on the rise again because of reactionary media painting us as villains, sideshow freaks, or like the continued radicalization of the far right. You know, they see us as a threat to Western civilization, and
I wish I was strong enough to destroy Western civilization.
yeah, me too. I'm gonna meet Western civilization behind a McDonald's and beat it up. And that's the thing. That's why I chose the name Mjolnir, because it makes me feel strong, though. And it makes
the patriarchy.
Yeah. Yeah, like I like the idea that I'm sort of taking on the mantle of like this incredibly powerful weapon that can only be held by people it deems worthy enough, and like that gives me a lot of strength.
I grew up in a very nice place. I think it was like a middle class area, even though we weren't actually middle class. It was a very nice sort of outskirts, like small town, and yet I was always just outcast from that community. You know, not only were there like specific people that I'd have to see every day in school who just absolutely despised me, but like there were people I didn't even know who like knew that there was this weirdo living in the same area as them, and I would get like accosted in the street by people I'd never met before who apparently knew me from somewhere. At the end of a flat party early last year, I did get like physically assaulted by a girl saying that like I was stealing femininity from her, and like I was a parody of femininity. You know, I just sort of shoved her off me and locked myself in my room. I felt for weeks even worse than usual, like I couldn't even, there was absolutely nowhere safe for me. Suddenly, everyone is a potential violent transphobe who wants to attack you. It takes a lot of trust in everyone around me to like allow myself to be vulnerable.
The thing that I feel least safe about is essentially when there is a unwanted attention and advances that generally like things dealing with mostly like sort of men on the street. It's difficult to discern is, for example, I'm feeling unsafe essentially because I am a woman and they're viewing me as a woman, or they've realized that I'm trans, because that's my bigger fear in a sense. And even worse to me is essentially the fact that like someone will make some incredibly inappropriate things because I'm a woman, and if they then later realize that I'm trans, that's actually the biggest sort of alarm bell in my brain of like, I really don't want this to happen. Sometimes I'm also around with my girlfriend and holding hands or, kissing, and I feel really bad because there have been people that have just said, cruel abuse that was very clearly homophobic. But then I basically every day I just spin you know, if somebody's being mean to me or treating me weirdly, I just have to spin a wheel and just go like, well, are you doing this because you're transphobic, because you're homophobic, or you're just sexist? Like, can you know this?
I feel in some way marked, you know, like there's a big red dot on my forehead, but at the same time, I feel as if there's a community of allies and supporters and people who truly care about human rights and you know, to enable that trans people are actually transported into this container of expected rights that everybody else enjoys. And I'm heartened by that. I feel somewhat secure in as far as I have a certain level of being able to pass, I think, you know, not least the fact that when I go out, you know, there's perhaps, you know, by and large, people would ascribe nothing. When they look at me, they'll think, well, she's a bit tall, perhaps, you know, unless I start to speak or there's identify a certain attribute that I have as to being suspiciously trans. I think there's a certain safety in being somewhat passable. Then you can just ingratiate yourself in life. But I do have tremendous empathy, indeed, for myself, given the fact that, you know, I'm at risk too, because I'm not ultimately someone who's had a lot of, you know, surgery and is able to totally, completely be stealth. You know, and that's not something I think everybody wants to do anyway. I wouldn't want to be stealth. I would want people to actually say, gosh, look at her. Good for you, you know. And I think it helps for us to be as visibly trans as possible to enable others that come behind us to feel confident that, hey, you know what? She's doing it. She's zipping it. She's doing it. And she's actually making waves. And, you know, perhaps those that could act as a inspiration or motivation for other people who are contemplating their gender, contemplating a shift in gender. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that.